Let's stand for the gospel reading. It's from Mark's gospel. And a woman was in the crowd who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see all the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "My daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Words inspired by God. Once upon a time, there was a young boy, and as he was walking out in the countryside one day, he saw a butterfly trying to work its way out of a cocoon. And the head was out, but the little insect was really struggling to get out. So he watched for about 10 minutes, and after the end of 10 minutes, it had barely made any kind of progress. And so the child, filled with compassion, felt that he needed to intervene here and to help the little insect emerge. So very gently with his fingernails, he began breaking the cocoon so that the butterfly could be released. And indeed, he set the butterfly free. And in the process, he crippled it for life. Because it is the struggle that the butterfly has to get out of the cocoon that actually releases the lactic acid into the wing structure of the butterfly. And so in the absence of that struggle, the butterfly could never actually fly. And so compassion sometimes doesn't have the consequences that we intend it to have. And I want to talk about compassion today. I'm going to suggest that compassion has 4 different stages, but I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. The first one I will call the physiological stage of compassion. The second one is the psychological stage of compassion. Thirdly, the sociological stage of compassion. And then fourthly, the spiritual stage of compassion. And my 5th point then will be, what would Jesus do? So let's begin with the physiological stage of compassion. And this is a stage which is totally unconscious. We are totally unaware of it. Have you ever had the experience where, let's say you're at a public lecture and you're listening to somebody speak, and the speaker has a frog in his throat, and unconsciously you're coughing on his behalf. Somehow you're picking up on his discomfort, and you're trying in your own body to try to relieve the frog in his throat. You're coughing as he speaks. And there's actually a neuronal basis for this. There are particular neurons in the brain which are called mirror neurons. So some very cruel experiments have been done where they took 2 monkeys and they rigged them up to electroencephalograms where they had electrodes on the brains of both monkeys. And then they tortured one of them. And they watched what areas of the brain of the monkey who was being tortured, what areas of the brain lit up. And lo and behold, the very same areas of the witnessing monkey also lit up. And that led to the discovery of what's now been called mirror neurons. That when we actually see somebody in distress, the same part of our brain gets activated that the person who's undergoing the suffering does. But this is totally unconscious. We are totally unaware that this process is happening. So I would call that the first stage of compassion, the physiological stage of compassion, and it is totally unconscious. So the second stage of compassion, I then believe, is the psychological stage of compassion. And it's not completely unconscious, but it's not conscious either. It's kind of subconscious. It involves the limbic system in the brain, the emotional center. So now we begin to feel emotions because we're watching the distress of another creature. Now, and that's really good because it can be the prelude to intervention and action of some kind. But there is when we're overdoing it, the symptoms are that we ourselves become psychologically disabled because of what we're witnessing and because of the emotional version of the compassion. And so, for instance, I'm seeing a lot of it right now, and I'm sure you're seeing a lot of it right now, that a whole bunch of people are being psychologically disabled, and some form of compassion because of the state our country is in, or the state our world is in. When we don't have adequate boundaries, then we become psychologically disabled by the compassion. And I've seen a lot of this over the last several years, and I'm sure you're picking up on it. That global situations or national situations can affect us, and that what happens is that because we don't have adequate boundaries, that we get infected by it, and it then represents itself as anxiety or depression or hopelessness or anger or even rage. It gets to act itself out in rage. So we're being affected by this second level of compassion because we're not handling it properly. We haven't got to the next two stages because there are 4 stages to it. We're stuck at stage 2. So there's a syndrome in psychology called a borderline personality disorder, and it's from damage that's done early on in a child's life where there's an invasion of boundaries. And very, very often, a person with borderline personality disorder has no boundaries themselves. And so they're very, very, very volatile, and they move between, great anxiety and euphoria on a constant basis. So it's called borderline personality disorder. That has to do with the invasion of boundaries. But there's something I've come across recently, which is called borderland personality disorder. It's where some people actually are picking up on the distress of the planet itself. But instead of being, able to hold that place and be compassionate in a productive way, it mixes in with their own anxiety and their own depression and their own hopelessness, and it can also lead to really anger and rage. So people who are concerned, for instance, about climate change or ecological situations, which is really good, and compassion is needed, and interventions are needed. But what happens is we can get totally thrown by it, be really anxious or fearful or hopeless or really, really angry and rage-filled. So we have to be careful, that we don't allow compassion to trip us up and become a source of pain itself and add to the distress. So that would be the second stage of compassion. It's the psychological stage. There's a third stage, I'm going to call it the sociological stage of compassion. And whereas the first stage was totally unconscious and the second stage was subconscious, this one is fully conscious. So now you're prepared to make an intervention in order to ameliorate the situation that's creating compassion in your heart. And so maybe, you're driving somebody to a doctor's appointment, or you're bringing food to somebody who's housebound, or you're volunteering, in the political arena, or to save the whales or whatever. So you're volunteering to try to rectify the situation you're witnessing. Or maybe, which happens often, you are the go-to person in your family. When there's any kind of distress in the family, everybody looks to you to kind of solve it. And in your compassion, you're reaching out and you're trying to make interventions. But like the other 2 stages of compassion, you can get tripped up by this as well. Because sometimes you're going to actually be resented by the beneficiaries of your compassion. Over a period of many, many years, as you're the person to kind of solve the problems for the family, at some stage, the beneficiaries are going to turn on you and blame you for not doing it better or faster. So sometimes it's easier to do stuff for people than to train people or challenge people to do it for themselves. So at that stage, stage 3, your compassion can still trip you up because it's a misunderstanding of the word responsibility. Sometimes we think that responsibility means it's my fault or I'm the person who has to kind of fix it. Responsibility just means I have the ability to make responses. And the response doesn't have to be to fix everything for everybody in all circumstances. So very often, this third level of compassion, it can lead to a codependency where, the savior and the victim need each other and they're both tripping each other up. I remember one stage I was doing a continuing education for my psychology license, and there was about 15 of us on a 3-day seminar. It was called TIR, Trauma Incident Reduction. But about half an hour into the very first session, a cell phone rang, and a woman picked it up and started talking. And then she excused herself and went outside, and came back in after 20 minutes, said it was one of our clients, so she was a therapist as well. One of our clients needed her. And so we went back into the lecture. Half an hour later, the phone rings again. She picks it up. She goes outside, excuses herself, and is missing for 40 minutes. Over the course of the first 2 days, she absented herself, I would say, maybe 14 times for half hour or 40 minutes each time. And finally, before the seminar finished, she went home to attend to the client. Now, for me, that is a terribly bad therapist. She obviously had created a dependency in this client of hers such that this other person felt she could contact her anytime she wanted, and she went home and she interrupted everything else. She was actually creating a victim out of this client of hers. She wasn't helping her. She was creating a dependency and actually a codependency. So it's the equivalent of you see somebody stuck down in a deep, deep pit, and instead of throwing them a rope and pulling them out, you jump in and there are 2 people stuck in the pit at this stage. So it's the difference between realizing that we can be channels for compassion, but we can't be the source of compassion. None of us is the source of compassion. We can be channels for it, but not sources for it. And when we attempt to be sources, we drain ourselves and we're not helping the other person. So it means we have to move on to I'm going to call it the 4th level of compassion. I'm going to call it the spiritual stage. And where the first stage was unconscious, and the second stage was subconscious, and the sociological stage was conscious, this stage, the spiritual stage, is superconscious. It's like the artist who's painting a mural on a big, big wall, who steps back from the mural in order to see the entire picture, and then moves in and begins working on particular details. But you have to be able to stand back from the picture in order to see where you're going. If you're up close, too close to the mural, you're going to make a lot of mistakes because you're not going to have the perspective. So all of us, as we exercise compassion, have to move from the physiological stage through the psychological stage and even the sociological stage into the spiritual stage. You have to come to the realization that when you've done all you can in a situation, you have to realize that the person you're attempting to help or to heal is an eternal soul and a child of God. They're God's children long before they became your child or your friend or whatever. So once you've done what you can and made sure that you're not jumping into the pit with this person or creating a codependency with this person, you have to realize that every one of us created a life plan before we came in. We created lessons that we needed to learn. So we have to make sure that we're not interfering with the lessons they've come to learn, that we're not breaking the cocoon out of which they're trying to wriggle in order to develop the wing structure, in order to fly. We have to make sure that we're not crippling the butterflies that we're attempting to save, whether they're family members or friends of ours or the political situation or our world itself. Every single one of us is here with a plan. The entire planet is here with a plan. The United States of America is here with a plan. And when we've done what we can do, we have to have the courage and the compassion to step back and realize that we may be delaying the other person's spiritual progress if we keep trying to solve their problems from them. Compassion is very different from taking over somebody's incarnational mission. That is not compassion. That's interference or is codependency. So it takes a much higher level of compassion. When you've done what you can do and you've made sure you're not creating a dependency or a codependency, to take an eternal perspective and realize that in God's time, this person is going to heal and grow and be fully a loving being. And you have to have the courage as well as the compassion and the patience as well as the compassion to stand back and let the process take its course. Which brings me to my 5th point. So what would Jesus do in a situation like this? And actually, there's a better question. Not what would he do? What did he do? And that was the reason that I chose the first reading today about the hemorrhaging woman. So it's a beautiful story. And the context is that Jairus, the synagogue leader in Capernaum, had found Jesus and asked him, please come to my home. My little daughter is dying, a 12-year-old child who's dying, please come. So Jesus rushes off to be with this little child to heal her. And there's a huge crowd following him. And in the crowd is this woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years and used all her money with doctors and got no respite whatsoever. And in her mind, she suddenly realizes, if I can just even touch the hem of his garment, I know I'm going to get better. So very surreptitiously, in this huge crowd, she gets up behind him, kind of bends down and touches his garment. And then Jesus does this weird thing. He turns around and he said, who touched my clothes? And the guy said to him, what? That's a ridiculous question. There's hundreds of people, millions. How do you mean who touched your clothes? He said, no, somebody touched my clothes. Power went out from me. And he kept looking around until finally the woman came forward and admitted what happened. Now, I'm sure she thought she was going to they were going to read her the riot act, because literally as a bleeding woman, she was contaminated according to Jewish law. And everybody she touched was contaminated. And before they could go back into the temple or the synagogue, they had to go through a purification ritual. So she was contaminating the crowd and she was contaminating Jesus. That's what she's thinking in her mind. But Jesus is thinking something totally different. Christ is not trying to embarrass this woman. He's trying to give her two lessons. He's saying to you, my daughter, you are not unclean. You are a child of God as much as I am a child of God. And the second thing I want you to realize, I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to empower you, because it was your faith that healed you. Not your faith in me, Jesus, that healed you, but your faith. You did it yourself. I'm just the screen on which you projected your inner divinity and your faith that things could change. You did this yourself. Now, how many times have we heard Jesus say after a miracle, it was your faith that did it? And we never hear it. Every time we hear it, we think, oh, it was my faith in Jesus that healed me, because Jesus' power was what helped me to get better. And you say, no, you're not getting it right. It was your faith that healed you. It was the God in you that healed you. You only used me as a screen to project your faith onto. You can do this on your own. You don't need me. And so Christ was not embarrassing this woman. He was empowering this woman and telling her, in the future, realize you are a child of God. You are not unclean. You are a daughter of God as much as I am a son of God, and you can do this for yourself. Now, there's the final end to that story where he says, power went out from me. What does that phrase mean? Have you ever seen these martial artists, these big guys who can I saw one guy lying on the floor with about 10 concrete blocks on top of his chest. And a guy came with a sledgehammer and whacked him and broke through all 12 concrete blocks, and the guy got out unscathed because he had focused his energy in such a way that he could, deal with the shock to the system. But I guarantee you, if he were unprepared and he's lying on the ground, asleep with the 12 concrete blocks in his chest, and you did the same thing, you'd smash his rib cage. So there's something about being prepared. And here was Jesus rushing off to cure a little 12-year-old girl. The last thing in his mind was that, somebody else was going to try to use him for healing. So he's not prepared. He's not focused right now. And so when this woman reached out, Jesus' own power got dissipated, because instead of being a channel, which he normally was, he was a channel to God, as each one of us is a channel to God. In that instance, he was a source. So he got totally depleted. So the power went out very, very quickly. And that's what he wanted to point out. And power went out because he wasn't focused and he wasn't prepared for that particular healing. Which means that as we engage in any healing practice, as a community, as individuals, we have to be connected to the source. We have to be ready to become channels for the healing to flow through us as individuals or as communities. We're not the source of the healing. And when we're not focused, we inadvertently become the source of the healing, and then we get drained. I've lived off the grid now for 25 years. There are no, PG&E doesn't come within 4 miles of my home. So I depend on the sun. And so I have a refrigerator, a washer, a dryer, a computer, a microwave, and all these work by solar power. But I had to kind of assess what my wattage need was, because different elements, use different power. So for instance, a microwave uses about 1600 watts. It's very, very heavy on juice. Computer uses very little. A light bulb can use just maybe 60 watts or 80 watts or 100 watts. But you have to total up the usage of everything, like microwave, washer, dryer, computer, fridge, printer, whatever, and figure out, then how many batteries do I need? How many solar panels do I need? How many inverters do I need in order to be able to kind of supply that need? So when my good friend Arlen Bronstein moved up, she's my neighbour, she lives about half a mile away. She moved up here 3 years ago now, and she set up her own solar system there. But the guy who designed her solar system didn't get the numbers right. So she put on her air conditioning one day. It was 115, outside. She put on her air conditioning, and then she went to the microwave and put on the microwave and blew the whole system, because the microwave and the AC overpowered her capacity, her battery capacity, and her solar capacity. And that's what happened when we're trying to be the source rather than the channel. That becomes so really important for us that we don't overextend the wattage, that we make sure that our batteries and our inverters and our solar panels are adequate to the job we're doing, but none of us becomes the sun. It's the sun that's providing the power. We can convert the sunlight into battery power, which then goes from DC to AC into our homes, but we are not the source. Even the batteries are not the source. Even the solar panels are not the source. Even the inverters are not the source. The sun is the source. So we have to be really careful in our compassion that we're not just operating physiologically or psychologically or sociologically. We're operating spiritually, and we're not being contaminated, getting anxious or angry about the situations that we're witnessing. We have to, having done what we can do, we have to transcend those situations and meta perspective and allow God to do her work at her own pace in her own methodology. So please, as you think about compassion in any situation, whether it's a family situation or a community situation or a national situation or a global situation, try to elevate ourselves beyond the physiological, beyond the psychological, beyond the sociological, into the spiritual. Namaste.